Joan of Arc. The baby Henry the Sixth became the king of England and France while he was still in diapers. But many of the French didn't want an English king to rule them. Instead, they wanted the Dauphin to be crowned the king of France. Do you remember the Dauphin, the Prince of France? He sent Henry V tennis balls when Henry first threatened to attack France. If it hadn't been for Henry, Dauphin would have inherited the French throne from his father, the King of France. And now that Henry was dead, he wanted his crown back. But not all of the French wanted Dauphin to be king. Some of the French thought that the baby Henry VI would go on to be a better king than Dauphin. The French followed the powerful nobleman called the Duke of Burgundy. They were Burgundians. They were called Burgundians. Now, France was divided in a civil war, a war where the people of a country fight against each other.
정지했어?
The French wanted Dauphin to rule was on one side, and the other were the Bulgarians. The French wanted the English French Henry VI to be king. The and English soldiers fought on the side of Bulgarians as well. Dauphin and his army needed to keep control of one of the most important cities in France, the city of Orleans. But Bulgarians and the English surrounded it and started a siege. Unless Dauphin and the rest of his army could drive the attackers away, Orleans would have to surrender. One day, Dauphin and his generals were planning on their next move to the headquarters when a messenger asked, "Sir, you announced a girl is demanding to see you. Who is it?" Dauphin snapped, "It is Joanne, the maid," the messenger said. "She says that God told her to save the city of Orleans from the siege." Now Dauphin knew who Joanne was. For several years he had been hearing rumors about this peasant girl. Joan of Arc claimed that the saints and angels appeared in her vision and told her to lead the prince into battle against the Dauphin enemies. But people believed her. A French knight had even given her a horse, armor, and soldiers to follow her. Now Joanne was here at Dauphin headquarters. But how could this girl help him get his throne back? "Send her away," he announced. But his advisors convinced him to see John. The people love her, they whispered to him. They believe that she has been sent by God to deliver France from the English. "Messiah, one of your gods has already insulted her." He told him, "Do not walk on or so near your death." Not more than an hour later, he fell into the moat and drowned. Manly Dauphin sighed. "Very well," he said. "Thunder him. If God sent her, she'll recognize me, even though she'd never seen me before." She gave his crown and royal robe to one of his friends to wear, and he hid in the crowd that filled the room. When Joanne came to the throne room, she ignored the man wearing the crown. She pushed through the crowd until she found Dauphin and knelt in front of him. "Dauphin," she said, "I've come to see you, crowned King of France." At this, Dauphin was almost convinced that Joanne was sent by God. But he ordered his priests and scholars to ask her a question about Christian faith to make sure that she was a true Christian and not a sorceress. When the priest told him that Joanne was a follower of God, Dauphin agreed to let her attack the army of the Bulgarians and English that surrounded Orleans. And arrived at Orleans at the headquarters of her army, she called out to the English to send there. But they shouted back, "We'll burn you if you ever get out of your our hands on you. You're nothing but a cowgirl. Go back and tend your animals at home. So Joanna ordered her generals, attack. The French soldiers, sure that Joanne was blessed by God, fought fiercely against the army. At last, the Bulgarians and English were forced to retreat from Orleans. Joanne had her first great victory. From now on, she was often called Joanne, the Maid of Orleans. Joanne was determined to take Daphotin to the great citadel and Reims in the center of the Christian faith in France, so that he would be crowned king. She marched to the Reims with Daphotin and her army, defeating the enemies as she went. Finally, Daphotin reached Reims and crowned king. Now she was Charles VII of France. All he had to do was to defeat the last remaining Bulgarians and then drive the rest of the English out of his country. Joanne was ready to help him, but Daphotin hesitated. And then finally he tried to make deals with some of the Bulgarian leaders, who told his army to wait while he sent messages back and forth. As time went on, his soldiers began to desert him. And then all of his deals fell through. The Bulgarians attacked him, his army was defeated, and Joanne was captured. Charles VII didn't even try to get Joanne back. He let the English and the Bulgarians put Joanne in trial for witchcraft. During the trial, no one liked John, who allowed to testify with her. Witnesses who hated her made up false stories about her. She was found guilty and was taken out to be burned alive. But still, Charles VII did nothing. So, in the year of 1431, Joanne was put to death. Many of the people saw her executed and executed wept. Even some of the English cried out, "We have burned a saint!" After Joanne's death, Charles VII and his generals finally managed to drive the English out of France. The Bulgarians swore alliance to the French king. Henry VI lost his claim to the throne of France. France was now free of England once more. It took 15 more years for Charles VII to remember Joanne. Probably as he grew older, he began to feel guilty about abandoning her to his enemies. Whatever the cause, he finally asked the church to examine the case of John. 25 years after John died, he was announced to be innocent of all charges against her, and 25 years too late. The war for the English throne. Wars of Roses. The French were the only people fighting with each other over the throne. Cousins from one side of the throne, family called Lancashire, and fought cousins from the other side called Yorks. York has white roses on their heads. Banners called the Lancashire had red roses on theirs. So today we call the English on the War of the Roses. The War of the Roses began during the reign of Henry VI, the baby of Henry V. When Henry VI grew up, he began ruling England for himself. He was a very good man. He spent hours and hours in prayer and refused to put his enemies to death. And he once even left a dance given in his honor because he thought the dress worn by the young ladies were decent enough. But Henry VI preferred reading and praying to ruling. Once he was reading in his room when his dukes came to ask him about a problem with his country. The king sighed and said to the priest who was with him, "They do so interrupt me day by day and night. I can hardly find a moment to read holy teachings without disturbance." After he'd been king for years, Henry VI had a fit of madness. Suddenly he stopped speaking to anyone. He sat in one place, staring in front of him for hours. He didn't seem to hear his friends when they spoke to him, even when they told him his wife had just given birth to a new son. Henry VI's madness was probably inherited. His grandfather, the King of France, had struggled with fits of insanity all his life. He believed that he was made of glass and that he could break if he fell over. Now this madness passed down to the English royal family. England needed someone to run the country while Henry VI recovered, so Henry's family asked Henry's distant cousin, the Duke of York, to become printer, or the substitute king. The Duke of York agreed. But when Henry VI began to get better, the York family didn't want to give up the throne. Henry and his queen had to gather an army and march against the Duke for the York government. After a huge battle, York's supporters were defeated and the Duke himself was killed. The queen ordered his head put on the city walls with a paper crown on it. Now Henry VI could rule again. The York's attempt to get the throne wasn't over. The Duke the York's son Edward nicknamed the York for victorious. They put Henry VI in jail. The year 1461, Edward took over the throne, proclaiming himself to be Edward VI, Edward IV, the rightful king of England. Edward was a handsome youth of the age of 19, 6 feet tall, a good dancer and a good fighter. Also a capable king. He learned the names of very important men in his kingdom so that he could greet everyone like a friend. But Edward fell in love with a woman his family didn't like. Elizabeth Woodville was older than he was. She had been married before to a knight who died fighting and Henry VI's side. Edward knew that his mother and his advisors would never approve of Elizabeth, so he married her in secret. So months later, when his advisor tried to arrange a marriage between Edward and a foreign princess, Edward had to admit that he was already married. He ordered London decorated in colorful paper and tinfoil and brought Elizabeth Woodville into the city in a great parade. He also gave her 5 brothers important jobs in the government. Many of the English nobles didn't like that, so they thought that the Woodvilles were gaining too much power. So several nobles joined together with Henry VI's supporters and let Henry VI out of jail, marched towards England's palace in the middle of the night to arrest him. But he heard that they were coming, jumped out of bed, and fled from the country. Now Henry VI was king again. Not for long. Edward was busy raising another army, who marched back into England and took Henry VI as prisoner. My cousin Henry VI said, when he was taken captive, I know that your hands, my life will not be in danger, but he was wrong. While he was in prison, someone killed him. We don't know who the murderer was. Edward probably gave the order for Henry VI's death. Now that his rival was gone, Henry VI was able to reign for 12 uninterrupted years, but he died in the year of 1483. His 12-year-old son became king in his place, but this young king, Edward V, was too young to rule all alone, so his uncle Richard, Edward VI's brother, fourth brother, offered his help. That was the end of the 12-year-old king's reign. Richard took over the throne and announced that he was the king of, Richard III of England. Young Edward V and his little brother mysteriously disappeared, and the people of England murmured about Richard's cruelty. They whispered that he had ordered the 2 of his brother's sons to be murdered so that he could take the throne. They told stories about his wickedness. According to one story, Richard was born with a full set of teeth and 8 live frogs for fun. According to another, he had a withered arm because of Elizabeth Woodville, the young king's mother, and put a curse on him. Richard may have gotten his crown by wickedness, but he didn't keep it for long. 2 years after he became king, another royal cousin, Henry Tudor, gathered yet another army and challenged Richard to claim the throne. In the year of 1485, Richard marched his own soldiers to meet Henry at the battleground in Bosworth Field. Richard should have won the Battle of Bosworth Field because his army was twice as big as Henry's. But his soldiers didn't fight very hard. And a matter of fact, Only a few hundred men were killed in battle. The rest surrendered. When Richard's advisors saw that Henry was winning, they told Richard to run, but Richard refused. "I will not budge a foot," he yelled. "I will die King of England," and he did. He was killed in battle, and the royal plume of his helmet was looped off and given to Henry Tudor. Henry put it on and announced that he was the new King of England. The Wars of Roses were finally over. The Princess in the Tower. Richard III died in the Battle of the Bosworth Field. He left a mystery behind him. Remember, the first Richard wasn't the king. He was the regent or his nephew, Edward V. But then Edward V and his little brother disappeared. What happened to those baby boys? No one knew. Here's something about the two princes in the tower. When Edward VI married Elizabeth Woodville, the woman in his family didn't like. They had two sons. The elder boy was named Edward after his mother. The younger boy was named Richard after his uncle. The younger boy lived with his mother, the Queen, in London, but Edward lived in the castle out in the country with servants and tutors to look after him. One of the Queen's brothers lived with him as his governor, but he made sure that Edward finished all the schoolwork and did as he was told to. When Edward IV died, his elder son was only 12. Someone needed him to help him rule England until he was old enough to be king of Rome. Edward had the papers making his brother Richard a protector or substitute king for the little boy. But young Edward's mother and her brother wanted to be the ones who helped the new king rule. So they didn't tell Richard, who was far away in the north of England, that Edward IV was dead. Instead, they planned to bring the little boy to London and have him crowned right away. Once young Edward was crowned king, he could choose his own helpers. But one of Richard's friends saw what was happening and sent a frantic message to Richard. "Pass in the capital with a strong force," he wrote. "Avenge the insult done by your enemies. You should take the young king immediately under your protection." As soon as Richard got this message, he set off for London and established London himself with a band of soldiers. He met Edward. His servants, and his governor on the way to London for the young king's crowning. When Richard saw Edward, he knelt down and bowed his head. But he also told his nephew, "Your mother and brothers are trying to take over your kingdom. And if you allow me to rule for you, they might get rid of you. I fear of your life." Edward insisted, "My mother and brothers are innocent of any wrongdoing." But Richard and his soldiers disagreed. They locked Edward's governor in the nearby inn and arrested Edward's soldiers and servants and soldiers. Richard put all of his own soldiers in their place. And Richard sent a message to Edward's mother and brother saying, "I have kidnapped the king, my nephew. I rescued him. I am more worried about his welfare than any of you. I'll bring him to London very shortly so that he can be crowned." The king and his brothers didn't believe Richard. They were sure that Richard would kill Edward and take the crown. But most people in London trusted Richard and refused to join the queen in fighting against him. So the queen took her younger son, Edward's little brother, and hid in the church where she would be safe. Meanwhile, Richard did what he said he would do. He brought young Edward, now King Edward V, to London and rode with him through the streets, and people chanted, "Long live the king!" He made all important people of the London swear lines to Edward V. But he still wouldn't allow the queen or her brothers to see Edward. And soon he suggested Edward to be safer. He moved to the Tower of London. The tower had been built hundreds of years before William the Conqueror as a jail. Since then, the other kings had added walls and buildings to the tower, so there was a palace as well as a jail. Edward had his own apartment in his tower with his own servants and soldiers, but all the servants and soldiers were chosen by Richard. Next, Richard sent a whole band of armed men to the church where the queen was staying. He ordered the queen to send Edward's little brother to the Tower of London to live with Edward. "Edward is lonely," the message said, "and he has no one to play with." The queen didn't want to send her youngest son to stay with the tower, then Richard had to have control of both of the heirs to the throne. With all those armed men surrounding her, she had no choice. She sent the little boy out to his uncle. Richard took his nephews who lived in the tower next to his brother Edward. The next day, Richard announced that Edward's coronation, the ceremony which would be crowned king, would be put off until later. A few days after, a famous priest preached a sermon saying that Richard, not Edward, should be king. And a few days after that, a group of noblemen gathered together and asked Richard to take the crown away from Edward for the good of the good. Many people suspected Richard had ordered the priests and the noblemen to say these things. The people who loved him as protector, when the men read in his journals, started to complain about him when he made himself king. Most people didn't complain, especially loudly, after Richard ordered Edward's governor to be beheaded. No one wanted to be next. Just a few weeks later, Richard rode to the Tower of London himself for his own coronation. His supporters crowned him king. Now, Richard, the king's uncle, was Richard III, the king of England. But what about Edward and his younger brother? They were still living in the tower, but fewer and fewer people were around to see them. Soon, the people of London began to murmur that the princess had been killed. The rumor spread through England and even over to France. But for the next 2 years, no one knew for sure what happened to the princes or what happened to them. Henry Tudor invaded England, killed Richard at the Battle of Portsmouth, and became king. When Henry arrived in London, the tower searched, but there was no sign of the boys. No one discovered what happened to the princes. 25 years later, one of Richard's knights claimed that he had murdered the 2 boys, but he confessed to avoid being tortured, so he might have made the story up. 2 important historians that wrote that Richard had ordered the boys killed, but both this historian wanted to please Henry VII, who replaced Richard on the throne, so they were anxious to make Richard look as bad as possible. Other historians suggested that Henry VII did away with the boys when he had the tower search, so that he would have no trouble keeping his throne. Almost 200 years later, the workers were cleaning a clutter of old buildings in the Tower of London when he found an old chest buried in the ground. When they opened the chest, they found 2 skeletons. Almost everyone agreed that 2 skeletons were those of the 2 princes. But who killed them? We never know for sure, but one thing is certain: in the late Middle Ages, being the heir to the throne was dangerous. The Kingdom of Spain and Portugal. Ferdinand and Isabella unite Spain. Now let's leave England and travel back over to Europe. Go across the English Channel, the water on England's southern side. Remember, the south is down on your map. You'll find yourself in France. The country that fought with England in 100 Years' War. Now go south, down to the left, then you'll cross another powerful country, Spain. We already read about the reconquest of Spain. And the Christian kingdoms of Spain conquered a land that had ruled by Muslims for hundreds of years. The reconquest was carried by a small Christian division kingdoms all over Spain, but one of these kingdoms joined together. 2 large powerful kingdoms called Aragon and Castile grew to cover most of Spain. A third, the smaller kingdom, Portugal, lay in the western coast of Spain. The king of Castile, king, was a young man with big ambitions. He wanted to make Castile into the greatest kingdom of Spain, but to do this, he needed more soldiers to fight for his army. So he promised one of his noblemen, a famous fighter named Pedro Guion, and his sister Isabella in marriage, in exchange for plenty of soldiers who would make the Armagnac army stronger. Pedro Guion was delighted by this offer. He could become the king and his brother-in-law by marrying the Castilian princess. But Isabella was horrified. She was only 13 years old. Pedro Guion was over 40. But he was a scoundrel with a reputation for drinking, quarreling, and killing. She begged her brother to call off the marriage, but he refused. A great wedding feast was planned. Soon the castle was full of cooking, stewing, and baking. But Isabella wept, weeping in her room, praying that something would happen to prevent this horrible marriage. Pedro Guion set up the wedding and found the looking about aloud is a great match. When on the journey, he began to feel sick. Before he could reach Isabella's castle, he died suddenly of stomach pains. Isabella was filled with joy and relief, but her relief didn't last for long. 4 years later, her brother decided to marry the king of Portugal, so that Portugal and Castile could be united into one stronger kingdom. The king of Portugal was a fat, wheezing man, old enough to be Isabella's father. Once again, Isabella begged her brother to change his mind, but once again he refused. "You'll marry the king of Portugal whether you'll like it or not," he told her. So Isabella sent a secret message to Ferdinand, the young prince of the kingdom from Aragon. She had never met Ferdinand, but he was just her own age. He had heard that he was handsome, courteous, and gentlemanlike. "My brother is determined to make a great match for me. I don't want to marry the king of Portugal. You're as good match as that woman. Meet me in a secret place in Castile and decide whether you'll marry me instead." Ferdinand agreed, but he didn't want anyone to know he was coming to Castile, so he ordered 6 of his knights together and told them to dress up like merchants in a trading caravan. Ferdinand put on rags and pretended to be their servant and a donkey trader, while Isabella crept out of her room in the middle of the night and stole a horse from his brother's stables and galloped away on horseback. When 2 met on a secret residence, they talked for 2 hours and decided to get married right away. 4 days later, they were husband and wife. Isabella's brother Eric was furious, but when he died 6 years later, Isabella became the queen of Castile. But when Ferdinand inherited the throne of Aragon, Isabella combined the 2 kingdoms into one large kingdom of Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella decided that they would finish the job of unifying Spain by conquering the last bit of Spain under the Muslim rule. This last Muslim stronghold was a small mountainous kingdom named Granada, where Muslim kings ruled over his subjects from a castle called Alhama. For 10 years, Ferdinand and Isabella battered away at Granada. Ferdinand himself led the army into battle. Isabella traveled all around Castile horseback, begging the men of Spain to join the army and fight. Finally, in the year of the war 1491, the Spanish armies were victorious. The Muslim king of Granada surrendered the castle of Alhambra and fled. According to legend, he turned around as he trudged out of Granada and sighed over the last view of his lost kingdom. But his mother was walking along behind him and was very angry for losing her home, snapped, "Don't wait like a woman. What you couldn't defend like a man." The place where the king stopped his head is called the last eye of the Moor. Now that Granada was there, Ferdinand and Isabella declared all Spain to be a Christian kingdom. They made it illegal to practice any other religion in Spain. The Jews who lived in Spain were forced to leave, and almost every Spanish village had Jewish family in it. So they sold their homes, often for mere pennies, and set out for Spain, and from Spain in overcrowded ships. Many died in the long, dangerous journey out of Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella were good rulers in many ways, but they also remembered for this unjust act. They brought all Spain together into one country, but they also forced the Jews from Spain to leave their homes forever. Henry the Navigator, the Prince of Portugal. Ferdinand and Isabella drew Castile, Aragon, and Granada together into one Spanish kingdom. Portugal, the kingdom of Spain's west court, kept its independence from the rest of Spain. Portugal was a small kingdom, not much wider than the state of Florida, and a long coast with beaches and harbors. Wild cats and pigs roamed the countryside. Eagles and falcons soared overhead. Flamingos stood in the marsh at the water's edge. The Portuguese are known for their grapes and olives and their tripe. Tripe was a medieval dish made of lining of cow stomachs cooked together with calf's feet, onion, and cow fat. The fermented apple cider, the Portuguese tripe, was one of the greatest delicacies in the world. Because Portugal had such a long coastline, it was easy for the Portuguese people to build boats and sail them. One Prince of Portugal, Henry, wanted to use these boats for more short trips. He wanted Portuguese to learn how to sail farther than anyone else in the world. Henry was worked on up the King of Portugal, which means he would never inherit the throne. And so he didn't need to worry about learning to rule Portugal. He could use his money and his time in another way to make the Portuguese into great sailors and explorers. He became, because of his love of the sea, Prince Henry became known as Henry the Navigator. Henry first began to think about building a fleet of sea-going ships when he was a young man, helping his brother fight in North Africa. Henry's father had sent them down to the North Africa to capture an important Muslim trading city. Merchants from Africa came to the city with ivory, gold, silver, and salt. Merchants from India came with spices, peppers, cloves, and nutmeg. In the Middle Ages, there were no refrigerators, so people put a lot of spices in their meat. That way, they could eat the meat even when it started to spoil. The spices covered up any bad tastes. Spices were so important that the pepper was almost worth its weight in gold. But Muslim traders knew that Portuguese were Christians who had driven the Muslims out of the country, and as soon as the Portuguese took control of the city, Muslim traders began to avoid it. Henry realized that if the Portuguese wanted gold and ivory from West Africa, they would do better to sail down to the African coast and trade with the West African types face to face. So he hired shipbuilders to build new ships that were fast and light, perfect for exploring strange waters. He paid map makers to draw a new map of the coastline so that sailors could know exactly where they were when they came ashore. So he built a school for navigating from a map to a certain destination. It was hard to do at sea, but there aren't any roads, trees, or landmarks. So Henry's sailors had to learn how to read star maps so that they could find the North Star and other important stars at different times during the year. They had to learn how to use an astrolabe, a special measuring tool, to measure how far the sun or the North Star lay above the horizon. And how far the sun or the North Star lay above the horizon, and they had to be able to calculate the ship's position. And from this information, they had to know how to use a compass, an instruction magnet with a magnetic needle that always pointed north. And they had to be able to calculate the ship's speed. In the way, just sailors measured how fast the ship was by tying knots together at regular intervals in a long rope. Then they would put the piece of wood and weights at the metal on one end of the rope and the wind on the other hand onto a reel. As the ship sailed, the wind on the other end into a reel. As soon as the ship sailed, the sailors would toss the wooden float off the back of the ship and turn over a glass which had just enough sand in it to run out in exactly 1 minute. And they would let the rope unwind while the sand tricked out of the glass. When they stopped the reel and counted the number of knots along the length of the rope, that had unwound. This tells them the speed of the ship. Today, a boat is said to be traveling at so many knots. One of Henry's soldiers learned how to navigate through unfamiliar waters. They were ready to head towards South Africa. They were fighting. No one had ever sailed down into the coast of Africa before. They called mysterious waters that lay in the Sea of Darkness. They were assured that the sea monsters and whirlpools lay in the Sea of Darkness. They were afraid that the oceans became so shallow that their ships would wreck on the sea's bottom. They were certain that their ship's strong currents would pull them off into nowhere, so that they would never return. And they thought that the sun down south was so hot that seawater boiled and roasted men alive. Henry tried to convince his men to sail further south. He paid expedition after expedition, but all the sailors were paid too much too frightened to go very far. Finally, after 14 expeditions, a brave explorer named Gil Ennis dared to venture down to the Sea of Darkness. and he discovered that the water is the same. There was the same as the water close to home. Gil Annas set out for his adventure in the year of 1434. In the years after his great journey, the Portuguese began to follow his example. They sailed further south and further down the coast of West Africa and traded for ivory, salt, gold, jewels, and ostrich eggs, sealskin, and slaves. Although Henry the Navigator had hoped that his ships would find their way to India, he died before this could happen. You see, maps in the Middle Ages didn't show how huge Africa was. No one had ever sailed all the way down to the continent, so mapmakers couldn't draw an accurate picture of Africa, and no one knew exactly how far they would have to sail to get to that strip of Africa. Some sailors thought the bottom of Africa might stretch all the way down to the bottom of the world. This is the end of this video. Bye.